What's up, I'm Ijemma and welcome back to my channel. In this video I want to show you how I've been taking advantage of Docker to containerize the Igbo API. For the longest time I actually didn't think I needed to use Docker for the API, but as I've been spending more time setting up testing environments and trying to work on separate features outside of the API, it only made sense to actually start looking into using Docker to help simplify the whole development process. So for this video I'm going to show you the Docker file that I created in order to Dockerize or containerize the API itself. Then on top of that, I'm going to show you the docker-compose file that I created to help orchestrate using multiple images for the API. I'm going to be assuming that you have some low-level understanding of Docker, so I'm going to be assuming maybe you know what containers and images and Docker files are and how to construct everything together. But if you're not too familiar or comfortable talking or learning about Docker at a very high level in this video, I'll link to the Fireship.io video that I watched, which was really all I needed to get started with using Docker. So that's in the description box below. So if you're comfortable with Docker and you're just looking for more examples of how projects use it, then here we go. So I'm inside of the Igbo API project, and inside this project I have a Docker file that is dedicated for containerizing our app. So we can take a look at the Docker file here, where I list out a couple of steps that are going to be ran when I want to create an image from this file. The first thing that I do is I set up my node version to be 12. That's the version that we use inside of Heroku, so we want to make it consistent across the board if anyone is ever using this Docker file. After that, I want to set my work directory to app, and then after setting my work directory to app, I copy over my package.json and my yarn lock files over into the work directory. Then I call a yarn install to install all my projects, dependencies, then copy over all of my project files. And then the last command that we run is yarn build, which is going to build up the entire API project. So after I built the project, I set up some environment variables. I define the port, the node environment that I'm in, which is test, and then the container host, which is MongoDB. And I'll explain why I actually had to create this environment variable called container host. Lastly, I want to use port forwarding to expose the port of this Docker container. This means that if I wanted to access the application from my browser while this Docker container is running, I can just type in localhost 8080 and I can see the app running inside of my browser. And the last line is my command that's going to be ran when my Docker container is starting up. It's going to use yarn start to start up the API. So this Docker file is as straightforward as you can find it. I set up my node version, I call a couple of commands to install dependencies and build the project, and then I define some environment variables and then define the action or the command that's going to be ran when I first start up my container. So now that I have my Docker file, I want to create an image, and then I want to spin up a container of that image. So I'm going to show you how I do that. So inside my terminal, I'm going to run docker build -t for tag, then name the image that I'm creating as testing API, and then dot. So what's happening now is that my Docker file is creating a Docker image that I could later share or use just to create a container of my application. So now that I have my Docker image, I can run it and see what it looks like inside of my browser. So I'm going to get the SHA or the ID of the image that I created. I'm going to run a docker run -p for port forwarding. And then I'm going to expose the port 8081 and connect it to the available port inside of my Docker image, which is 8080. And then I'm going to provide the ID image to create a container. Now you can see inside here that I was able to start up an instance of my app. So this is a container running right here, right now in front of us. So if I go to localhost 8081, I should see an instance of my application running right here. So this makes it really easy just to quickly spin up an instance of my application so I can see it running at a very high level. But this only containerizes the source code inside the API. So any third-party packages that I'm using, like MongoDB for example, isn't going to be contained inside of this Docker image. So that's where Docker-compose comes in, where I can start orchestrating multiple containers and running them at the same time, and they can actually speak to each other back and forth. If we go back into the terminal, you can actually see that the problem already started, where we see this error, mongoose server selection error. Basically what's happening here is that it's telling us that it couldn't connect to our MongoDB instance because our Docker container hasn't spun up a separate container for our MongoDB database. So if we use Docker-compose, we can actually address this issue by spinning up two separate containers, one of which is our MongoDB backend, and then the second is going to be our API. So taking a closer look at the syntax of this YAML file, I first define the version of the Docker-compose file that I want to use. Then I want to list out all of the services or containers that I'm going to spin up. The first service I define is my MongoDB container, which is actually pointing to the Mongo latest image. So what I'm doing right here is that I'm pulling the image from the public MongoDB registry, and then I'm going to use that image to spin up a new container of my MongoDB database. And I'm going to name my container Mongo. Then I define the volumes key, which is the location where I want to save all of my temporary data that I'm going to generate inside of this Docker container. And then I expose the super classic MongoDB port 27017. After that, I create another container, which is called server, and I name my container Igbo API server. And then I have some extra configurations, like I want to restart this container whenever something fails. Here I specify that I want to actually grab all my source code from the current directory that I'm in, but if you didn't have direct access to the source code of the container that you want to spin up, then you can just point to the image that will be used to spin up the container. Again, here I expose my ports 8080, and then I say right here that this container relies on my other container, which is MongoDB. So now what's happening with Docker Compose is that not only am I spinning up my API, but I'm also spinning up a separate instance of my MongoDB database. So now that we have Docker Compose all set up for this project, we can run it using the command docker-compose. So inside the terminal, I'm going to type in docker-compose and then use the command up to spin up our Docker Compose instance. Now you can see that we actually have a little bit more information going on. You can see that we have two separate containers running at the same time, them being the Igbo API server container and then our Mongo container. And if we look inside of the logs, we can actually see that our server started on port 8080. So if I go back into my browser and I run localhost 8080, you can see that our application is running on that port. And if we go back inside of our terminal, you can see that at no point are we going to be getting MongoDB error saying that a connection was unsuccessful. So I want to explain why I created the environment variable container host and set it to the value of MongoDB. So when I was setting up my Docker Compose file, it made a lot of sense to me at a very high level what I wanted to achieve. I wanted to spin up my API and my MongoDB instance separately, but at the same time, and I wanted them to talk to each other by exposing certain ports. So when I was working for the Docker Compose file, it made a lot of sense to me to expose the port 27017 and then reference that port inside of my API source code. If I go into config.js, you can see that happening right here on line 18, where I have my MongoDB URI, and then I specify the port that I want to point to. But then when I spun up my Docker Compose instance, I realized that my API container wasn't directly connecting to my MongoDB container. But after doing a little bit of research on this, it turns out that I actually have to specify the name of the Mongo host that I want to refer to depending on what environment I'm in. So before I was dealing with Docker, I always had localhost inside of my Mongo root URI. So it would always say MongoDB localhost :27017. That made a lot of sense because when I was running it on my machine, I would just have all my ports being forwarded to localhost. But when I set up my Docker containers, I had to rethink about which environment I'm running in. So instead of pointing to localhost, I actually had to point to the container that's responsible for running my MongoDB instance. So the name of the container responsible for running my MongoDB instance, according to my Docker file, should be MongoDB. And this name, or this value, has to connect to the name found inside of my services object inside of Docker Compose. So what's happening here is my Docker file, when it's spinning up my container, is basically saying when I'm inside of a Docker container, I'm going to look for the service name MongoDB. So MongoDB has to match with the service name right here, which is MongoDB. So by doing that, my Docker container for my API knows to look for the MongoDB service name instead of localhost. But this is how the project uses Docker files and Docker Compose to make testing and even cross-project feature development a lot easier. If you have any questions on how I set up this project or why I configure things in a certain way, you want a little bit more clarity on something, please leave your questions in the comment section down below and I'll be happy to answer them. That's it. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see y'all in the next one.